Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Well, today we reach the fourth episode in our third series of Way of the Fathers. With the Gospel, we're moving from one ancient city to another, exploring their streets and meeting their citizens. Today we reach the city that marks the earthly destination of the Acts of the Apostles. They call it the Eternal City. It's always changing and always the same. It's home to ancient temples and modern skyscrapers. It's the capital of one of the great nations of modern times, but every street and alley preserves memories of the time when it was the capital of the world. Turn a corner and the Colosseum looms ahead, impossibly huge even in its broken splendor. Turn another corner and there's Trajan's Column with its pictorial record of the conquest of far-off Dacia, today's Romania, which still preserves the name of its Roman conquerors more than 1900 years later. And right across the street from Trajan's Column are two churches with magnificent domes, almost right next to each other. Because, in a way, this is still the capital of the world. Rome is the seat of the Catholic Church, the biggest religious organization on earth. Wherever you are on the globe, Rome still has authority. But now it's an authority that doesn't depend on legions with spears. It's the authority Christ gave to Peter, the apostle his friends would have voted least likely to succeed. No one would have guessed when Rome was founded that it would become anything important. Antioch was built to be a capital city from the beginning. Rome was just a village in the hills along the Tiber River. Legend says it was founded in 753 BC by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers who were descended from Trojans who fled after the Greek army destroyed Troy. For a long time, it was governed by kings from Rome's much more powerful neighbors, the Etruscans. Then the Romans threw out their Etruscan masters and governed themselves as a republic. As a republic, they conquered the whole Mediterranean world. But all that conquering bred strong military leaders who were impatient with laws and formalities. A few years before the birth of Christ, after a long series of civil wars, Augustus made himself emperor. He was indisputably the head man in charge of the whole Roman government. From then on, the Roman world was governed by emperors. They kept all the old institutions of the republic. They just made sure those institutions didn't have any power to stand in their way. By the time of Augustus, Rome was the biggest city in the world. It had 1 million people crowded into narrow streets of high-rise tenements, more than 40,000 apartment buildings, according to one count. And since it was the city that ruled the whole world, or at least all the parts of the world that were important to Romans, it attracted all kinds of people from all over. The Latin-speaking Romans often complained about all the strange people with strange customs who were taking up residence in their city. But when you conquer the world, you have to expect a few immigrants. One of the groups they complained about most often was the Jews. By the time of Christ, there was a large Jewish population in Rome. It was large enough that the xenophobic Romans were worried about it. These were people who spoke Greek, had strange customs, and dressed differently. This large Jewish population would have given the first Christians a familiar base of operations. The earliest Christians started in the Jewish community wherever they went, and in Rome, a Latin-speaking city, the Jews were a group who spoke the familiar Greek of the eastern half of the empire. We don't know who the first Christians were in Rome. They might have been sailors, or soldiers, or merchants, ordinary people who had heard the good news and brought it with them as they traveled. By the time St. Paul was writing his longest letter, there was already a large congregation in Rome, and Paul hadn't been there yet. Peter wasn't there at the time either. Paul wouldn't have left Cephas out of the long list of personal greetings at the end. When Peter arrived at Rome, he took over the leadership of the church there. Scripture doesn't tell us when he got there. The Acts of the Apostles ends with Paul still on his way to Rome and Peter not there yet. But tradition and later writers are so universally agreed that Peter was the first leader of the Christian church in Rome that no serious historian can doubt it. Peter and his flock knew that he could not live forever on earth. But would the end of the world come before he died? No, but the end of Rome nearly did. In the year 64, a fire started in Rome that spread out of control and burned for 9 days. When it was finally burned out, more than half the city was in ashes. The Emperor Nero immediately started building an extravagant palace on the ruins, which led to common gossip that Nero had started the fire to clear the land he coveted. Looking around for a scapegoat, Nero hit on the new and weird sect of the Christians. They had become distinct enough that people knew who they were and believed all kinds of strange rumors about them. They thought the end of the world was near, didn't they? They probably started the fire to bring the end of the world closer. That was the story Nero wanted people to have in their minds anyway. He started rounding up the Christians and torturing them to death for entertainment of the Roman people. The Roman people liked it. They wanted more. Peter and Paul were among the martyrs. Tradition says that Peter was crucified upside down at his own request because he thought he was not worthy to die the same death as his Lord. Paul was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens could not be crucified, so he was beheaded instead. Nero's persecution established a precedent. Until then, there had been no official Roman policy about the Christians, but now it was officially illegal to be a Christian, and the penalty was death. That was the grim background against which the church started growing explosively. A Christian might be taken and sent to die at any time, and Christians' deaths were popular entertainment. That massive Colosseum that still looms in Rome, still the biggest amphitheater in the world, was often filled to capacity with crowds who had come to enjoy the spectacle of Christians being torn apart by wild animals. This was the average Roman's idea of fun. But these martyrdoms didn't discourage the Christians. In fact, they just made more Christians. And as the church all over the Roman world grew, it looked to Peter's successors as its leaders. St. Clement of Rome is one of the earliest Christian writers outside the Bible. According to one tradition, he was the second bishop of Rome after Peter. According to another, he was the fourth after Linus and Anacletus. Clement himself had been a disciple of Peter. So when Clement acts as though he has authority over the other churches, it's fair to assume that he takes that authority from Peter. Clement's letter to the church in Corinth is addressing some of the same problems that St. Paul's 2 letters to the Corinthians addressed. The Corinthian church was full of bickering factions, and one faction had tossed out some leaders that Clement thought ought to be reinstated. For us, what's important about the letter is that Clement assumes he has the authority to tell the Corinthians to knock it off. After some complimentary phrases designed to put his correspondents in a receptive mood, he starts telling the Corinthians, by the authority of the Holy Spirit, what needs to be done. In the other direction, we already saw, when we talked about Antioch, how St. Ignatius of Antioch deferred to the Roman Church, the church that presides over the brotherhood of love, as he called it. In the very earliest days of the church, the most important Christian figures were already assuming that the church at Rome was the leader of all the churches, and its bishop had the authority to decide on questions of faith and discipline. Throughout the age of the Fathers, this faith didn't waver. In the middle 200s, for example, St. Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, one of the most important Christian churches, wrote to Pope Sixtus II to ask about the validity of heretical baptism. He said, "For truly, brother, I am in need of counsel, and I ask your judgment concerning a certain matter which has come to me, fearing that I may be in error." Pope Sixtus is not remembered as one of the great theologians of all time, but he had the authority of Peter, and that was what Dionysius needed. This is the strange thing about the church in Rome. There aren't very many early church fathers with "of Rome" after their names. Yet the Bishop of Rome was clearly recognized as the leader of the whole church right from the beginning. When the greatest minds of the ancient church turned to the Bishop of Rome for definitive answers, it was not because he was smarter than they were, but because he had the authority. The clearest statement of Rome's authority came not from a pope, but from St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote an encyclopedia of Christian heresies not long before the year 200. We'll hear more about him when we get to Lugdunum, but it's worth hearing how he explains the way to tell which of the many ideas claiming to be Christian is the right one. All we have to do, he says, is point to that tradition derived from the apostles, of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. For it is necessary for every church, that is, the faithful everywhere, to agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. This doesn't mean that Irenaeus thought the Pope was always right. When Pope Victor excommunicated the churches of Asia for celebrating Easter on a different date, Irenaeus sent him a letter advising him to reconsider and preserve the peace between the churches. He didn't contest Victor's authority to make that decision, but he was ready to tell Victor what he thought of it. It's precisely because he recognized Victor as leader of the whole church that he felt compelled to write the letter he wrote. So far, we've met some of the leaders of the Roman Church and seen what the great minds from elsewhere said about Rome's leadership. But we also know more about the ordinary Christians of Rome than we know about the Christians anywhere else, because they left a vivid record of their lives in one of the world's most amazing time capsules. One of the gloomy necessities of life in the big city is disposing of citizens who die. The ancient Romans had a superstitious horror of dead bodies, and of course, it's also true that corpses can carry infections. For religious and sanitary reasons, it was the law that bodies could not be buried within the city walls. Cremation was the general practice of pagan Romans, but Jews and Christians usually buried their dead. Conveniently, the hills just outside the city were riddled with abandoned quarries that made a good start on an underground tomb complex. And as soon as they started burying their dead in these networks of tunnels, the Christians started decorating them. These Christian images show us everything that was important to the people who were buried in the catacombs, and to the friends and families who survived them. Sometimes we see Christ, the apostles, or the martyrs. The earliest artistic images of Christ that have survived are in the catacombs, very often as the Good Shepherd carrying a lamb on his shoulders. Images from Old Testament history are also very popular. But we also see scenes from ordinary life, things that would remind visitors to the tomb of what the Christians buried there had done when they were alive. You can see a greengrocer selling his greens, a barrel maker's shop, a shoemaker's tools, bargemen crossing the river. These precious records tell us more about the daily lives of Roman Christians than volumes of theology, no matter how important that theology is. They make those early Christians live again in our imaginations. Well, everything changed for the Christians when Constantine the Great took over the empire in the year 312. On the eve of the battle for Rome, Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He rode into Rome victorious and Christian, and from then on, except during the reign of Julian the Apostate, the emperors were Christian. Not the aristocracy in the city of Rome, though. Some of them were Christians, but a large percentage of the senators remained stubbornly pagan for decades. But the Roman Senate had been mostly irrelevant for a long time now, and it was about to become even more irrelevant. Constantine decided to move his imperial capital to the east, picking the small but easily defended Greek city of Byzantium. Calling it New Rome, he set about building it into a capital city that would eclipse the old Rome in the west. It would soon be known by his own name, Constantinople. This was the beginning of a long, slow decline in importance for Rome. It was still the biggest city in the world for a long while after that, but the emperors were usually somewhere else. More and more, the empire was split into eastern and western halves, with the two emperors cooperating or trying to kill each other, depending on their moods. And the emperors in the west more and more ignored Rome, preferring to make their capital at Milan, where they could be closer to the barbarians who needed fighting, or Ravenna, where they could be as far from the action as possible. Still, Constantine and his successors put up lavish Christian churches in Rome. Several of them still stand. They were built on the model of the Roman judgment hall, the basilica. Pagan temples were not places where people gathered for worship services, so they didn't work as models for Christian churches. The judgment hall was a place where a large audience gathered to hear the speeches and watch the judges make their decisions, so it was well adapted to the Christian liturgy. Meanwhile, Roman power was weakening. The last Roman emperor to control the whole empire, east and west, was Theodosius the Great. He died at the age of 48 and left his sons in charge. The one in the east, Arcadius, was 17 years old. The one in the west, Honorius, was 10. Honorius was a weak and treacherous ruler, and in his reign the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked by barbarian Goths. It was a much gentler sacking than most cities got in ancient times. Alaric, who was an Arian Christian, gave his soldiers strict orders that they were just to plunder the city, not to massacre the inhabitants. Citizens could go to the churches for refuge, and the soldiers wouldn't touch them. Still, it wasn't a good time to be in Rome. Alaric could give his soldiers whatever orders he liked, but a barbarian mob turned loose on the richest city in the world wasn't going to be too careful about breaking things. St. Jerome was in Palestine when he heard the news. He reacted with the same shock and horror that overcame almost everyone else in the empire. If this could happen in Rome, who was safe? He wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat, and as I dictate, sobs choke my utterance. The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken." It was not the end for Rome, but it felt like the end of the world. It had been 800 years since the last time a foreign enemy had entered the city. The impregnable capital of the world was at the mercy of the barbarians. Nevertheless, Rome continued and even recovered. But now barbarian raids were a thing the people in the city had to worry about, and they were beginning to learn that emperors couldn't or wouldn't save them. They would have to look for help to the only really effective leader they had, the Pope. They learned that lesson very well when the fearsome Attila the Hun came roaring through the empire, bearing down on the city of Rome. Attila and his horde were an apocalypse on horseback. No Roman force could stand in their way. But Pope Leo went out from Rome unarmed and talked to Attila. No one knows what he said, but Attila turned around and went away, and Rome was spared. It would be hard to put the thing more clearly than that. Emperors and armies are worthless. Only the Bishop of Rome can save his city. Yet even Leo the Great, as history remembers him, could not save Rome from the Vandals in the year 455. The best he could do was come to an agreement that the inhabitants wouldn't be massacred while the Vandals pillaged the city for 10 days. They were so thorough about it that they gave their name to the act of wanton destruction, which we still call vandalism today. As provinces fell away, the Roman Empire in the west was reduced to Italy and a few surrounding areas. But there was a Western emperor until 476, when the last one disappeared. Because the complex organization of Roman government had fallen apart, the popes had to take up more and more authority. In the year 590, when Rome was still suffering from waves of barbarians, this time the Lombards, a pope named Gregory came to the throne of Peter and began to reimagine the church as a spiritual empire. By any standard, Gregory the Great was an extraordinary leader. He reformed the liturgy. We still call the characteristic music of Catholic worship Gregorian chant. He wrote a book of dialogues of the saints that was so influential, he is still remembered in the Eastern churches as St. Gregory the Dialogist. In the English-speaking world, he's remembered as the Pope who organized a mission to the pagan English, which began the conversion of England to Christianity. Closer to home, he organized the Roman Church into an effective government for the city, keeping careful accounts of the alms given to the church and organizing the distribution to make sure they went where they were needed. Gregory the Great marks the division between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. He saw the problem of his time clearly. No one else was taking care of basic needs, so the church would have to step in and do some organizing. And Gregory was a genius at organizing. It was Gregory who built the papacy into the closest thing the West would have to a real government for the next few centuries. Once again, all roads would lead to Rome. Once again, Rome would be the capital of the known world, but it would be a different kind of domination. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Way of the Fathers. And if you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. We are entirely listener-funded, and so we're utterly dependent on you. So please go now to our form at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Make your donation and let us know that you love the Fathers. And remember, we pray for our listeners and benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.